This is Kris Coates again. We're with Gardening 101 Part 2. We're going to continue with getting the dirt on soil, and specifically we're going to talk about the organic components of that soil. What's organic? Organic matter is anything that is currently living or once lived, plant or animal. And as I said before, it makes up an extremely small part of the soil, but it is so important to your soil. Organic matter benefits: carbon and energy sources for all those little soil microbes that are in your soil. In other words, food for them. As we mentioned before, it helps to hold soil particles together, forming aggregates. Okay, and supplies and stores nutrients like nitrogen, which is very important to our soil and our plants. It also improves the soil's ability to store and move both water and air. And it helps the soil from being compacted. It retains carbon from our atmosphere and other sources. It reduces the negative environmental effects of pesticides and other pollutants, kind of acts as a filter. And it increases the water infiltration and reduces the runoff for your soil. It encourages your plants to develop roots and for those roots to penetrate into the soil. And of course, it reduces soil erosion. So those are all very good things that we need from our organic matter. Now, all that organic matter and all those little microorganisms and some of the macroorganisms form what we call a soil food web. This is just a very basic schematic of what a soil food web might look like. You start over on the left with plants growing in the soil. Eventually they die, and that residue from them is food for bacteria, fungi, both mycorrhizal and saprophytic fungi. So this is kind of the beginnings of the breakdown of that organic matter. These little microorganisms really kind of break things apart and start the whole thing. Now you'll also notice on the second level we have nematodes. The nematodes in this first level are root feeders, like root knot nematodes. You've probably heard of those. And we don't like those. They're not good for the plants. But they eventually die and become food for the microorganisms also. They also become food as you move into the third level for small arthropods. These little guys shred stuff up, kind of like if you have a shredder that you put leaves and trees and branches through. These little guys are shredding the remains of organic matter and some of the items that the fungi and bacteria have started to decompose. Now you'll also notice we have nematodes in the third level again. These guys are feeding on fungi and bacteria that are in the soil. So they're good nematodes. And of course we have protozoas of various types that are also feeding on bacteria and fungi. Now if you go over to the fourth level, we have larger arthropods. These are the guys that you're probably going to see crawling around the garden. These guys are predators, and so they will eat other insects in the garden that are perhaps eating your plants. And we also have more nematodes. These nematodes are also predators. So again, this whole fourth level is helping you. We have our arthropod predators and our nematode predators, and of course they in turn are preyed upon by birds and small animals such as moles. This makes for a very healthy soil. These all help to feed your plants. Earthworms, very important for our soil. Their wastes, called castings, are extremely nutritious for your plants. Also, the earthworms create more pore spaces, linking the surface to the subsoil layers. They bring a lot of nutrition from lower in the soil up to where the plant roots are. It's very easy to add worms to your soil. If you don't have any, you dig around and you don't see any, go down to one of the sporting goods stores, buy some worms, fishing worms. There are people that sell worms in particular. Sometimes you see that person or several of them at some of the farmers markets, but you don't have to buy fancy worms. Any worms will work. Night crawlers, red wigglers, whatever. My husband just really gets upset with me because I commonly go down during the summer a couple of times to the sporting goods store and I'll buy $20 worth of worms and throw them into the garden. And my husband thinks that's really silly. But anyhow, definitely worms are very good for the garden. We talked a little bit earlier about pH in the first section. Basically, pH is a measure of is your soil acidic or alkaline. pH of 7 is neutral, it's in the middle. Anything to the left of pH 7 is acidic, anything to the right is alkaline. Most of the soils in our area, and in fact in Arizona in general, are somewhere between 7.8 to 8 pH, which means they're very alkaline. What does alkalinity do or pH do? pH affects the nutrient availability. And you can see from this chart here, okay, there's a little box about where our soil usually hits, pH 7.8 to 8. And you can see the availability from the different types of things. Now, you can see in the lower left side, iron, copper, zinc, molybdenum, those are almost non-existent in our soil. Our soil availability of nitrogen, if the soil has nitrogen, is good. Phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, even magnesium, those are pretty much available in our soil. So is molybdenum. Boron, the plants need so little boron, it's not a big deal. The thing that you will most often find with pH is that iron is lacking. Actually, it's not lacking. The iron is available in the soil, but because of our pH being so alkaline, the plants cannot get to the molecules of iron. So that is why we like to try and lower our pH. The best way to do that is with a pelleted sulfur. Unfortunately, you're going to have to do this every year because our water is also alkaline. So as you're watering and working your soil, it is what it is. So you can adjust it a little bit by the year, but you have to do it every year. One of the ways to solve some of this from landscape plants is to use plants that are native or very well adapted to our type of soil. If you're growing vegetable gardens, you're going to have to adjust your soil a little bit for the pH, because most vegetables like a soil that's a little bit more towards the neutral to slightly, very slightly acidic. Chemical or organic, that's the big argument. In truth, it doesn't matter, because nutrients in plants are taken in at the molecular level. And nitrogen is nitrogen, whether it comes from a chemical form, a chemical fertilizer, or an organic form of fertilizer, such as manure. The nitrogen molecule is the same. It doesn't matter. But many people, the White Mountain Community Garden also, is an organic garden. And we like to work and feed the soil, feed that soil food web, so that our plants do not need the chemical fertilizers. But that's certainly something that is up to you, whether you prefer to use the chemical fertilizers and amendments or the organic fertilizers and amendments. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those. There are 16 essential plant nutrients. These are needed by every plant in order to survive and grow and thrive. Now, 3 of these nutrients are non-mineral, and they just come to the plant through air and water: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So we don't have to worry about those. Those are available. But besides these non-mineral nutrients, we have 13 nutrients that are usually found in the soil. These are divided into 2 groups: the macronutrients, or the big 3, plus 3 additional, and the micronutrients, and there are 7 of those. What we have here are the big 3, which of course is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You might know potassium as potash because that's what it used to be called. And these are mostly in the soil except for nitrogen. You're pretty much, for our soils, especially if you're vegetable gardening, you're going to need to add nitrogen annually. Now, if it's a landscape plant, you're probably not going to have to do that for it, particularly if it's a native or a well-adapted plant to our area. But for our vegetable gardens, plan on adding that nitrogen. Okay, the next 3, what we call the big 3 plus 3 more, these 3 are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Mostly these are also available in the soil, so we don't have to worry a whole lot about those. The big thing to worry about is the nitrogen. Micronutrients, these are just teensy amounts of these are needed. Boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. So the micronutrients, very small amounts. The macronutrients, larger amounts are needed. Now, you look at the big 3, they will be on any fertilizer, organic or chemical product that you purchase. And then they'll also have additional items that you might need that might be in the fertilizer makeup. These are not the actual amounts of the nutrient in it. They are a percentage amount of how much is in there. And we'll have an example of that in the next slide, I believe. Nitrogen is important because, of course, it makes up a large percentage of chlorophyll, and it's a major part of the photosynthesis of the plant, amino acids which plants produce, and the building blocks for proteins and the nucleic acids such as DNA. Phosphorus is essential for plant growth. It stimulates the growth of young plants, kind of helping them to be vigorous and giving them a vigorous start. Potassium is necessary for a lot of different plant functions, including carbohydrate metabolism, osmotic pressure, photosynthesis, and so on down the line. Potassium really helps plants over the whole spectrum of their life processes. So these are what we call the big 3. So, how can we improve our soil? Well, number 1, we want to work towards building that good soil food web. If you're not an organic gardener and you're using the chemicals, many of those chemicals in those chemical fertilizers are going to damage your soil food web. And that's, if you're using chemical fertilizers, that's fine, it's your choice. But be aware that your soil food web will not be functioning, or at least was not functioning very well. And so you're going to have to keep using those chemical fertilizers on a regular basis. If you're an organic gardener and you're working toward a good soil food web, then you don't have to worry so much about that. These little organisms and their larger counterparts, as we saw in the slide a while ago, they take care of things and supply a lot of the nutrients that your plants need. The second thing you can do to help improve your soil, keep it covered. Things like clovers, annual, not perennial, but annual grasses, buckwheat, etc. There's a whole lot of different cover crops that you can use. And why would you want to put a cover crop in? Well, it protects your soil from erosion when you're not growing anything else in your garden, like maybe through the winter. It will keep weeds at bay, and some of these cover crops can even be used while you're growing your vegetables, and so they will help to crowd out the weeds. And of course, many of these cover crops will provide homes and food for those pollinators that you are going to want to come to your garden. Also, cover crops, I hate to say this, but they add beauty to the garden. Sometimes our vegetable gardens can look pretty ho-hum, but by putting cover crops in them and even flowers, which we'll talk about later on, it adds beauty to your garden. And again, they bring in those pollinators, which we need. Here's a biggie: don't till your soil. I used to get out there every spring with the rototiller too, and then I learned that I'm destroying my soil food web, I'm destroying my continuous pore space, I'm compacting my soil, and I'm reducing the organic matter in the soil. Tilling is very bad for your garden. Now, if it's a new garden, this is your first year, yes, you are going to have to till or do some double digging or something like that. But once your garden is growing, like from the second year on, don't till it. Disrupt the soil as little as possible. You can take your nutrients, your manures, your amendments, things like that, add them to the top of the soil and let those worms and microbes go up and bring that stuff down. They will do that. Amendments, let me count the ways I can spend money. There are so many amendments out there, some organic, some chemical, and it's up to you to choose which way you want to go. Let's look at a couple of these amendments. We talked about chemical versus organic fertilizers before, so we know that plants take that nutrition in at the molecular level. Basically, organic fertilizers and amendments have a natural slow release. You will also see, if you compare packages at the store, you will see that organic fertilizers have a lower nutrient level. And they're basically made up of dead things. Chemical fertilizers come in many forms. Basically, they're just chemical compounds. We talked about the fact that they do disrupt your soil food web, and if you use too much, you can actually burn your plant's roots with them. Too much is not a good thing, so follow the directions on the container that you purchase. Chemical or organics come in basically three ways to deliver them. Liquid, which are great for containers. Maybe you have an iron deficient plant, it's showing a little iron chlorosis. That's a good time to use a liquid. But liquids don't stick around very long. They need frequent applications. Granular is the most popular and certainly the cheapest, and they generally stay around the soil for a reasonable length of time, certainly longer than liquids. Slow release is the most expensive. Basically, you're going to see slow release in chemical fertilizers because the organic is a naturally slow release. The organic slow release is because the soil microbes need to further reduce the materials in that organic fertilizer to the molecular level, whereas slow release chemical fertilizers are wrapped in a little chemical ball that slowly dissolves over time. Now, one of the things you want to watch when you're picking up that bottle of slow release chemical fertilizer, look at the temperature that it best releases at. If your temperature is higher or lower than the temperature at which they have manufactured that amendment to release, then that's going to affect the release. If you're colder, it's going to release slower. If you're warmer, it's going to release faster. Looking at an example here, We can see on our fertilizer bag on the left there, it's 10-20-10. And that's basically a ratio of 1 to 1. 1 pound nitrogen, 2 pounds phosphorus, 1 pound potassium. And that's released per 1,000 square feet. And a ratio of 10-20-20-10 or 6-12-6, anything like that, it's the same as our example. Fertilizer companies will put their ratios in different manners. We might consider a ratio of 10-10-10. That's considered balanced because it's got equal amounts of each of the big three. Now, nitrogen can also be bought in a pure nitrogen form, which would be something like 20-0-0. And this could be a chemical or a organic fertilizer. Potassium and phosphorus, those last a lot longer in the soil. So maybe you don't want to put as much in there. You might want a 10-5-5 fertilizer. If you're raising fruit and nut trees, which need a higher level of potassium, you might go for a 20-10-20 or maybe even a 10-10-20 ratio of fertilizer. There are crops that are very heavy nitrogen feeders, such as your cole crops like cauliflower and broccoli. You would maybe want to put in a higher nitrogen fertilizer, maybe a 20-5-5. Amendments, organic amendments. Yes, we've talked about they're made from dead things, slower release, and lower nutrient levels. What are they? Manures. Cow, goat, chicken, also horse manure. Now, with manures, particularly cow and horse, you want to make sure that they are very well composted. Raw manure can burn your plants. So you want any manure, but particularly horse and cow manure, to be very well composted. Compost itself, well, you can make it at home, or you can buy a good brand of compost. This is a very good thing to add to your soil. Sphagnum moss or coir are very good also. These will eventually be turned into nutrients by your soil food web. Coir is the newer thing. It's basically ground up coconut husks. It's considered maybe more ecologically responsible because sphagnum moss takes centuries to form in the peat bogs. Sphagnum is basically the living green part, and peat is the dead part down below at the bottom of the peat beds. Sphagnum basically lives, dies, and becomes peat. So there are also a lot of organic fertilizers out there. Always read the label, whatever you're buying. Some organic fertilizers are not totally organic. Making your own compost is a whole class all by itself. You can find a lot of information on the internet about making your own compost. Basically, if you follow the directions on the screen, you can be pretty good. It's not hard, but it's not fast. It can take anywhere from 3 months to a year or even 2 years. The most important things, you're making levels of brown and green waste. You're going to keep it somewhat contained, and you're going to keep it not wet, but moist, kind of like a damp sponge. Then you want to turn it very often because you need to add oxygen in there. Never put meat or any type of fat or scraps like that in there. And your compost should not smell if you're doing it right. If it smells, you've got a problem and you need to go back and see, maybe you need to add more oxygen, maybe you need to keep it a little more moist. Something there is wrong. And when you're finished with your compost, you shouldn't be able to tell what in the world it was that went into it. It should just be a nice, fine, dark material that is very friable. Are there any homemade things that you can add to your garden? The best book that I have ever found on the subject is The Truth About Garden Remedies by Jeff Gilman. He tells you what the remedy is, what the actual science behind it is, and why the remedy does or does not work. So there are a lot of remedies. Some of them are actually harmful to your plants. So be very careful about even adding grandmother's homemade fertilizer recipe. There are a couple of common things that actually do work. Epsom salts. These have magnesium and sulfur, and they're very useful, especially again for those coal crops that are higher feeders and plants like poinsettias and chrysanthemums that actually have higher levels of magnesium in their leaves. But it doesn't have any effect on soil pH. A lot of times we say add Epsom salts to make your soil more acidic. It doesn't. If you want to make your soil more acidic, you need pelleted sulfur. A lot of people like to grind up eggshells and put them into the soil for calcium and phosphorus, and eventually, over a long period of time here, that those nutrients will be available. However, it might be a little quicker and easier if you're making hard-boiled eggs at home. Take that water from the hard-boiled eggs and pour that around the plants. That will actually get the nutrients to them much quicker than the shells themselves. Now, IBA and NAA, these are actually chemicals. You go down to the store and you buy rooting hormone. It's going to have one or both of these chemicals in it. They are very effective for rooting cuttings, particularly hardwood cuttings. So if you're trying to make cuttings off your berry bushes or something, you probably want to go down and get some of the rooting hormone. Chelates are chemicals that are bound to elements like iron that allow plants to use these nutrients over a wider range of pH than would normally be. If you're going to get iron to put on a plant that has a shortage of iron and is showing the chlorosis, get chelated iron. Well, we will see you next week for parts 3 and 4 of Gardening 101.